everybody. Welcome. My name is Leah Sims. I'll be your host today. I'm joined by some of my beautiful friends to talk about a popular subject, marriage. There's so much that we want to jump in on today and share with you on that subject and really stitch all of that together around the table of God. But before we do that, I want to ask each of my friends to introduce themselves and to let you know who they are. And then we're going to spend about an hour or so together talking about marriage. This will be the first of two recordings. So we're going to do part one and a part two because we have so much to talk about and we can't cover it all in an hour. So look for two recordings on this topic in the coming days. So Melissa, I'm going to start with you. If you could introduce yourself, let us know your name, what you do for career or ministry, and then tell us a little bit about your family and how long you've been married. And then we'll go to Brandy and then Danielle. You're on mute.
My name is Melissa Shallery. I am a wife and a mom to a 21-year-old. In the marketplace, I'm an executive assistant for a major hospital system here in Jacksonville, Florida. I've attended Celebration Church since 2011, and I'm a deacon in our church, sisterhood leader, and a freedom warrior. Thank you for having me.
Tell us about your family.
Thank you. So I'm married to Andrew. We've been married for almost 16 years, been together for 20, and we have a son whose name is Sean Michael, and he's 21, and he's a United States Army soldier. Thank you.
Hi guys, I'm Brandy Cortez Hickson. I am, first Leah, thank you for inviting me to be part of the conversation and to come to the table. I'm a content coordinator for a local church, Pneuma Life Church. I also work with our women's ministry there, Girl Gang, and I'm a writer and a podcaster and a teacher. I am married to my husband, Jason. We have been married since 2012, but together for 12 years. And we are a blended family. I brought all of the blend into the family. So I have 4 kids that they're 23, 21. I have a daughter-in-law who's also just turned 21. I have a almost 17-year-old daughter and a 13-year-old son. So hands are full.
Beautiful. Thank you. Danielle.
Hi, I'm Danielle. I work on staff at Celebration Church. I am married. I've been married for 10 years now, and we have 2 boys, 9 and 11. So needless to say, I am running all the time, really, really busy. I also have a side hustle with a brand called Ivy Birch that my mother-in-law branch are just launched. And so, yeah, I'm really busy.
Thank you for being here. Christina.
Hi, everybody. I'm Christina Morellis. I'm married to Raul. We've been married this month 18 years, together a little over 20. We have 4 children together, 4 daughters, 26, 22, 18, and 15. We have 2 granddaughters. We love our family time. It's everything to us. I'm on staff at Celebration as the outreach coordinator, and glad to be here with you ladies.
Thank you so much. Danielle.
Hi guys, I'm Danielle Bridges. I am married to the hottest man on the planet, and we are high school sweethearts. We have been together for 24 years in September, but we've only been married 14. It took him 9 years to propose to me, and we have 2 kids. A boy that is 16 and a daughter that will be 13 in 2 weeks. I attend Celebration Church. We've been going there since I was pregnant with her, minus a few journeys elsewhere, and come back home. And let me think. I love women's ministry. It's my heart. And that's it.
That's awesome. Thank you. I should share that I'm married for the 3rd time, so we'll get into that in part 2 of this series. So some might say that disqualifies me from being able to talk about marriage, but I can tell you when you've failed at it a few times, it gives you a lot of insight and a different kind of wisdom to share. I'm married now for the last and final time. 3rd time was truly a charm for me to an amazing man, Grady. He's a firefighter, paramedic, love of my life. I have 2 children. We have 3 children. I have 2 from a previous marriage, a 25-year-old son, Peyton, 21-year-old daughter Madison and our child together, Aiden, who's 12. And I work for Verizon. I oversee Verizon's global healthcare practice, but I'm also a part-time women's ministry leader, author, and teacher, and just convener of women. That's my favorite thing to do, is to get together with women and talk about life and ministry and faith and challenge. And truly, that's how this series was born. It came from just the conversations that I have with everyone that's on this screen right now and other women in my life when we get together at church or small groups or birthday parties or whatever it is. We always get to the stuff of life. It's amazing to me that we rarely camp out on superficial topics. We get right to the deep stuff usually. And so I can tell you so much of what I've learned as a woman has come from just sitting in a company of women and soaking up experience and wisdom. And so often we'll get together and someone will say something or share a testimony or share wisdom about marriage or parenting. And I think everybody needs to hear that. Other people need to hear that story. And so this was a great way. We're all sort of emerging from the cocoon of COVID-19 quarantining right now. Many of us still kind of hanging close to home. And so all of us have become intimately familiar with Zoom and webinar technologies. And so this seemed like a good time in this moment of divine pause to talk about some things so that when we step out of this season, we will be even more ready people to love and to serve and to carry that wisdom into other groups. So today we're going to talk about marriage, but the frame out for this series has really been around the table of God. I can't even tell you how prominent the theme and the symbol of a table has been in my own life. They're everywhere. God uses tables and the theme of table to speak to me all the time. I have a really big farmhouse table in my house where women gather. And a number of years ago, 6 years ago, when my husband built that, I had no idea at the time how powerful that symbol was going to become in my life and in the life of our church, and what getting back to table, getting back to family, gathering and breaking bread, sharing in Shabbat, and really understanding the value of conversations that happen when we're relaxed and we're breaking bread together at the table. And what a powerful picture it is of the kingdom of God and the relationship that God wants to have with us when he calls us to his table as family members, not just as soldiers. There's so many metaphors that we could use for the way we're called into the company of God and into the family of God, but nothing more intimate to us than the idea of being family, of being daughters and sons at the table of God. So in the first installment of this series, which is posted to my webpage and to my Facebook author page, and I'll link to it later, you can go back and see the frame out for this series, which was really unpacking Psalm 23:5. Where David says that the Lord prepares a table for us in the presence of our enemies, and that there our cup overflows. And there's some references there to that everything we need from God, everything we see set up in Psalm 23 from verses 1-5 about provision and peace and protection, God leads us to his table and we find those things there. And that when we can sit in relationship and in peace and trust at the table of God, the enemy can prowl around us all he wants to, and he can't pick us off when we're resting in the provision of God at the table. So the next conversation I wanted to have was, what about that guy sitting next to you at the table? Sometimes that's a tough relationship when both of us don't get to the table at the same time in terms of spiritual journey, when there's challenge in the marriage and we're not in agreement at that table, what that looks like. And so we're going to land towards the end of this conversation on what it means, how important marriage is at that table of God. But I want to talk about some practical stuff first and really just dive in on the subject of marriage in general. So for this first half, we're going to talk about expectations. We all have them. We came into marriage with them. Every girl dreams about marriage. I won't say every. Most girls spend some time in their youth dreaming about marriage. Usually we're dreaming about weddings, less than we're dreaming about marriage. And so it takes us a little by surprise when that beautiful big wedding is over, or what version of a wedding we had. And then the real marriage begins, and we have to learn to do life every single day with that other half that's now become one flesh with us. So we're going to talk about expectations. We're going to talk about both the blessing and the challenges that children coming into that picture pose. And then we'll move on to conflict. How do we solve conflict in marriage? But let's start with something fun. I'd like everybody, we'll go around one at a time, and let's just go in the same order that you guys introduced yourselves. How did you and your husband meet? Just a quick story. And then what is your favorite thing about your husband? Because I want to start from a loving place. You know, Danielle, you said when you introduced yourself, married to a hunk, I can't remember what your exact words were, but you are 24 years into this and he's still everything to you. And I want to make sure that we're framing this from the beginning and about getting back to the loving place where that's really the epicenter of what we think about and what we feel. So let's start with a little bit of romance, because that's a great place and women love to start there. So Melissa, how did you and Andy meet, and what's your absolute favorite thing about him?
We actually met at a time when neither one of us were walking with the Lord. I met him on the internet in a Yahoo chat room, and I invited him to a party, but I had also invited some other boys to the party, and a couple of them came, and he really was not my type. In fact, I thought about ditching him when he went to go pay the bill, but I decided to stick around and quickly learned that night that I never wanted to be a day apart from him. He's amazing. But there's so many things to love about him, but he is so much fun. He's a practical joker. I tend to be wound pretty tight, and so God perfectly designed him just for me. He makes life so much fun. In fact, I used to call him Bad Andy, not as a bad term, but because he was just so naughty. He made life fun, and unfortunately, many of you have been part of his pranks. You've had to endure them as well. But he has a big heart, and he so giving. So much to love about him. Thank you.
He is. We all love him. Brandy.
Yeah, so I met my husband Jason at work. We were both working for a company, and we initially, I did not like him at all. And much like Andy and Melissa, I was not impressed. He was a sales guy, and he had a very sales guy way about him. And my job, I was an assistant director of portfolio management at the time. So I had to manage the clients that had schmoozed into buying things. And it didn't always go as smoothly as I would have liked. But over time, he kind of sucked me in. And I think my feelings about him, he's brilliant. He's a very intelligent man, and he's witty and funny, and he's also very consistent and incredibly empathetic. And I tell him all the time that even before he knew the Lord, he reminded me more of Jesus, a lot of Christian men I had encountered, just in the way he carried himself and the way he would give his shirt off his back to anybody that needed it without a second thought. And it was very easy to fall in love with him.
It's easy to fall in love with a kind man, isn't it? Thank you. Yeah, Jason's amazing. Danielle, where'd you and Matt meet, and what's your favorite thing about him?
Well, similar to Brandy and Melissa, we met pre-Jesus. Well, pre-Jesus for me. Matt was saved when we met. And when we met at Orange Park Medical Center. I'm not really going to get into the story because it's not the best story. But we did meet at the hospital, and the Lord told him, that's going to be your wife. But I had no interest in Matt whatsoever. So he continued to pursue, convinced me to go on a date with him by sweet talking my mom. And so we went on a date, and yeah, the rest is what it is. I would say that my favorite thing about Matt is how funny he is. I think I'm losing. Am I losing you or no?
Yeah, you're a little laggy. We can hear
Okay.
you. It's just your video that's lagging, so your audio is doing great. Your audio is
Okay.
doing fine.
Okay, sorry. So my favorite thing is how funny he is. He literally, I can come in from the worst day ever, and within 2.5 seconds, I have tears rolling down my face because he is just genuinely funny. Also, my favorite thing is that he's just in a place now where he's just so true to himself. And so it's just really nice to finally see the husband that I always knew he was, and to actually see him step in to that man that I know God has called him to be. And so this season for us has been a very interesting one, which we'll dive into a little bit later. But yeah, I think that's probably my favorite thing, is just finally seeing him for who he is.
That's beautiful. I can't wait for you to share your story because it's such a great one. Christina.
Okay. So Raul and I knew each other as teenagers, but we did not, our worlds did not collide. He actually hung out with my siblings. And when he would come to my house, I would actually shut the door and not let him in because we were just so very different, and I didn't want to be around him. It was in our 20s after we both had one daughter each, living our lives way before Jesus, that we met out with a group of friends, and I was crazy head over heels, but it took 9 months for us to make that connection. And we lived together and did all the wrong things, like I said, pre-Jesus. But we brought our 5 and 2-year-old into the marriage. And my favorite thing about Raul is his playfulness, because I'm so serious most of the time, and it brings balance. It brings balance to our house, and the girls love that too.
You guys are a beautiful couple. Danielle.
Okay, so for me, we met, like I said, in high school. So I've been smitten with him since the first time I saw him, and I knew that I wanted to be with him, and so it was just a matter of time. I pursued him, and I wasn't taking no for an answer. I remember writing my senior year, even after we dated for a few years, on my papers, what do you want to be when you grow up? I would say Aaron Bridges' wife and the mother of his children. I was dead serious about it. So thank you, Jesus, that those things came true. But as far as what I love about him, he's genuinely the best man I have ever known, even on his worst day and even with his flaws. I love him, like who he is, what he stands for. I love that he brings balance to me as well, because I'm very much an extrovert. I'm very much out there. So he levels me, he balances me out. And so he's definitely the yin to my yang.
You more than anyone I know. If someone said name a friend who's crazy about their husband, it would be you. I would point to you. I would say that about myself too, but you definitely, because you never miss an opportunity to talk about how much you love him. And so I will share that Grady and I met. We've been together 16, married 16, together 18 years, and we met when I was just coming out of a really painful divorce. I brought 2 young children out of a really broken marriage, which I'll talk about later. But and I wasn't ready for a relationship of any kind. In fact, I was really in a mental place where if someone even suggested to me that I should go out with somebody, I probably would have, again, pre-Jesus, would have bitten their heads off, because I didn't want another relationship. And I also didn't feel like I was good at them. But I was in a particularly low point. My brother, who's about 9 or 10 years younger than me, calls me one night on a Sunday night. I was struggling with shared custody and the realities of shared custody and not having my children with me all the time, and how unprepared I was for how painful that is and how difficult it is. And my brother calls me and says, I want you to come up to the restaurant where I work. I'm gonna feed you dinner, and then we're gonna go out afterwards. And he had to really talk me into it. In fact, he called me back 5 minutes later and said, shower, do your hair, and put some makeup on. And I didn't even realize that his boss was Grady at the restaurant where he worked, and he was setting us up together. And so I got there not knowing I was being set up, and spent the evening talking to Grady, and we went out afterwards to Harmonious Monks to hear a band play. And people asked me if it was love at first sight, and I can say yes, it was. But it was also love and fear at first sight, because I wasn't ready to get in a relationship again, and it would take me a while before I was ready to do that. And we made some of those same mistakes, Christina. In fact, we were just about to move in together some months after that when Grady got saved. I rededicated my life to the Lord, and we found Celebration Church. And he had sold his house and was about to move in with me, and had to make other arrangements because we just made the commitment that we were going to pivot and go in a different direction. Probably the hardest next year of my life, having to keep that commitment until we finally got married. But it was a beautiful year, and it's been a great relationship since then. We've been at Celebration all that time, and we got married at Celebration, and so church has just been a big part of church, and faith in God have been a big part of our growth as a couple, and our identity as a couple. So that was a fun start. I love hearing everybody's stories because they're the beginning. That's the jumping off point, the romantic, how we got together. And everybody has some version of that, and it's always beautiful. But then we get into those early days of marriage, and we look over at that person and go, this is who I'm waking up to next to me every day. Because sometimes, we see people in a much more realistic light. I think there's a point where the bloom doesn't necessarily come off the rose, but we get a real picture. I think a lot of times we go into marriage with our eyes shut, because we just don't know yet what we're going to encounter. And I think when we can open our eyes and we see the person that we're married to and they see us, that's when love really, really begins. That's the starting point of what I think is truly a love story and a marriage story. So let's talk about expectations, because we all bring them into a marriage. Some of them are shaped by what we saw our parents do, the way our moms and dads related to each other, or other married couples in our world. So some of it's cultural, some of it's generational, some of it's just dreamy expectations, and some of it's our brokenness that we bring into relationships, and we expect the person we're with to fill all of our gaps and to heal all of our wounds. And when they don't, they inevitably tumble off that pedestal we put them on, right? So I want to talk about expectations. And Danielle, I want to come to you first. Few things shape the dynamics of a marriage more than the expectations we carry into it. So what expectations did you have about marriage before you got married? And how have you had to shift or modify or change what you expect, both from marriage and from your husband, once you got married?
Expectations, in my opinion, is probably the hardest thing that we have to deal with, because I think expectations really shape how we interact as a whole, as well as on a day-to-day basis, and in our conversations, how we handle everything. And it can be from anything from big expectations going all the way back to, like, for say, when we're little girls and we grow up watching Cinderella, and how, her whole life is better when the prince comes. And I very much had a Cinderella story. I was not from a home with healthy marriages. And so I very much didn't even realize that I thought that Aaron was going to rescue me. And I remember, and I didn't have the words or the full revelation of it, but I remember even crying on my honeymoon for a couple of days. And it wasn't until years later that I realized that when I woke up and I was still the same, and I still had brokenness and hurt, like I don't know how I thought this man that I had been with for 10 years already was going to miraculously change into someone else, or change me. But anyways, I just realized the impact that even just the Cinderella stories, like I said, mold your expectations, and that it's not real at all. So as far as for me, I remember when God gave me the revelation that I had put the pressure on Aaron to love me enough for everybody that had never loved me my whole life. And God asked me to remove that pressure and that responsibility from Aaron, because he was very much telling me, I'm your Prince Charming. I am genuinely, truly the love of your life. And I am the only one that can fill in the gaps for you. And that changed everything for me, because no man's shoulders are big enough to carry the weight of needing to love me enough for everybody who had ever failed me. Because the minute that he did anything that didn't quite line up with my expectations, I immediately went into fear and panic that maybe he didn't love me, even if he had done right by me a thousand times before that very moment. But that was because I was so broken and the Lord was still healing those places in me.
That's good. I think we all carry some of that or a lot of it into our relationships for sure. Cinderella syndrome is a big one that I think we all go into marriage with a little bit of. Christina, thoughts on that?
Yeah, so very similar to Danielle. My expectations were that it was going to be peaceful and fairy tale and so romantic all the time. Again, and I'll keep saying this was before Jesus. So as we each brought in a daughter, and then started to have our own our children together, career, different things started to change or be added in where I saw those expectations were very unrealistic. Started to experience heartbreak, and we had trust issues after one of our girls was born. So the expectations not only were not being met, we were faced with a lot of trials, and in that we were actually headed to divorce. And this was such a great moment. Looking back now, I see how God, he was just pursuing us. He was pursuing us, and he wanted a hold of that marriage. Our one of our girls was going to church because we were not. And long story short, we started to talk about, well, how can we take our family to church? We believe, not understanding the spiritual realm, we believe God was after us. So we went into Grace Bible in Virginia Beach for the first time. Our girls not knowing, that was the last straw for me. I said, okay, I'm going to try this, God, but we are headed towards divorce by the end of this week. And so I walked in, and that pastor was given a message on, excuse me, marriage, and said, if you are in trouble, give me 6 weeks. Give me 6 weeks. This was New Year's Day, 2011. And I just broke down. I broke down, and I was like, God is talking to me. And so what happened, from there, in a nutshell, was I realized my expectations were never placed in God's hands. And so we just fully gave God our marriage. We surrendered our marriage to God. And it's been quite a road. We've learned a lot. We really thought we knew a lot going into that moment, but it's been hysterical, and so full of joy watching what we didn't know and what God had to show us for our marriage.
Melissa?
Like the other ladies, as a young girl, had started to craft this fictional character in my mind of what the perfect husband would be like, because I came from a broken home. And in my first marriage, it was very broken. And when I met Andy, he rescued me. And he was that character that I had built. He was all the things. And I felt secure and loved and beautiful and cherished. But when life happened, we met, and then 3 months later, we decided to marry. But dating, seeing each other a couple of weeks, and then living with someone is two different ballparks. And having the added layer of being a military, and now a military significant other, we had that other added layer. So I put a lot of expectations on him, and comparison, that was a big enemy. And so we found ourselves in some rocky places, and that was all before social media. So we didn't even have that issue back then. But he's stayed by my side through all of that, and I'm so thankful. But that was all prior to Jesus, and everything changed when we came to the Lord.
Yeah, I would say that I think for me, a lot of the expectations that I had coming into well, I think you bring different expectations into each marriage. So when you're remarried, you bring expectations that it's going to be different than your last one, and you're looking for somebody different, and you think, if I just change my set of expectations or shift them to this new place, all of that will automatically fill in. They're no better in the second or third marriage than they were in the first one, because none of them are placed in God's hands. But I can say that that a lot of the expectations I had was that I would be cared for, taken care of. And I think a lot of women need that. But I also, being an independent person, I had expectations that I could still do things on my own. And I figured out pretty quickly that that's not how that happens in marriage. And so there are a lot of expectations we have to lay down. Some of them are the expectations of what the difference between single life and married life looks like, what finances together look like. And we're not going to jump into finances too much, but I think we could certainly talk about the expectations there of who manages the money and who does the bills and who's responsible for cleaning. And I mean, there's all of those. If you grew up in a house where the husband worked, came home, and the wife did all the cleaning and the cooking, and sort of that a traditional marriage. Well, if you didn't both come from that, you're going to hit a roadblock pretty quickly if those expectations aren't the same. And so one of the things I know, when we were going through our premarital counseling at Celebration, expectations was a big one, and diving in on who is it in your home that did this when you were growing up versus was it always mom who did the laundry, but in this house everybody did their own laundry? Well, then something as little as who does the laundry can become a contention point, and it all comes from what you either grew up with or expected to happen. And so all of us get into relationships where some of those early conversations, your jaw drops to the floor and you go, really? That's how it was for you when you were growing up? Because that's not how it was for me. And so the more we can have those conversations early on, the better. So expectations are a big part of that. Anybody else want to weigh in on expectations before we move on to kids and children?
I was actually going to say, as far as expectations, I mentioned the bit of, a big Cinderella one, but then I also was thinking about expectations, like down to like even the smaller things, like expecting for them to define something the same way that you do, or expecting for them to be on the same page as you all the time, expecting for them to have the same love language as you, expecting for them to have the same temperament as you, expecting them to want to be intimate at the same time that you are or not, expecting them to have the same opinion as you when it comes to dealing with children. Or, I mean, literally so many things. Like, I remember the other day saying to him something about romance, and his definition of it and my definition of it were literally not even on the same scope. Like, I was blown away, and that's one of those things like that you just can't take for granted, and just one of those things that makes you realize, you're bringing such different minds to the table, even though you live with them. And like in my case, I've been with him for over 20 years. He still does not think like me. He's not made up like me. All the different temperaments, which we talk about all the time. They even mold your expectations. So,
Melissa?
There's a verse that I read recently that I love that I think is really relevant to this. It's in the Song of Songs 2:15. You must catch the troubling foxes, those little sly foxes that hinder our relationship, for they raid our budding vineyard of love to ruin what I've planted for you. And I think expectations can definitely be a big fox, and we have to catch those and manage that.
Well, because there's so many of them. To Danielle's point, it's not any one. It's a parade of little foxes that slip in there about a number of things in terms of expectations. So yeah, I mean, it's a conversation you have to have early on, and I think it's about seeing and listening and truly understanding the other person. I'm the older I get, the more I realize that you cannot really love someone you don't know. That may seem like a big duh, but really, if we're not, I don't care if that's friendship, marriage, race relations, which, so much prevalent on our landscape always, but especially right now. How can I truly love a person if I don't understand them? Then I don't even know who I'm loving. So if I don't know their temperament, I don't know their expectations, I don't know what their childhood was like, I can't see through their eyes and know what their view of life, marriage, parenting, and all of that was. How can I truly love them until I know that? And so I think in so many ways, it starts with, to your point about foxes, is actually having to look for them. And to do that means you have to sit and spend time and not just talk at our husbands because a lot of times women, we want so much to be understood that we spend most of the time trying to get our husbands to understand us and not as much time trying to understand them. I'll be the first to admit that I think I've done more of that in my marriage than vice versa. And God is teaching me that if I spent more time trying to understand him, half of the issues I have issues with would probably go away. That's takes some time, right, to do that. All right, so let's pivot and talk about kids. Nothing says the honeymoon is over quite like the arrival of babies and children. Not only from an intimacy perspective, which we'll talk about later, but just when you go from being a couple of two to a family of three, or Christine, in your case, you were an immediate family of four, and Brandy, you and I the same. We have blendeds, but even in my first relationship, before kids came along, there's a huge difference between what you are as a couple before kids and what you become when kids enter the picture. They're such a beautiful gift, whether or not we were planning for them. And we all make those adjustments, but man, is there a huge impact on marriage. And a lot of people's trouble with marriage, really the root of it begins there, because there's a separation and a dividing of attention and a dividing of loyalty and a dividing of love and a dividing of focus and all of this. And it's not meant to be divisive. It's actually meant to unify us as a family. But where a marriage is concerned, it's heavy, it's pressure. And when that happens, it can shift some things. So Danielle and Brandy, I'm going to go to you guys first and ask you, how did your relationships with your husbands change? And if you have to go back to when babies were in the picture, Brandy, that's good. Just in terms of how marriage changes when babies come in, and also blended family there. So how did that change? What's been the hardest part of having kids when it comes to your marriage, to relationship and intimacy? And what advice would you give to young wives and new moms who either haven't hit that moment yet, or they're heading into it, or they're just now experiencing it? Because it's quite a shock when it happens. Again, we have these sort of dreamy expectation of marriage, and when babies come and we're tired and we don't get sleep. That first year, I didn't sleep. I think I slept 2.2 hours for the first year that my babies were there, because you're up all night, and I felt like a zombie for the first year with all three of my children. And it definitely shifts your libido. It changes your tolerance for things. So many things there. So I'm going to pause there. Danielle, if you'll go first, and then we'll throw it over to Brandy. How did that change for you?
Okay, sorry if my video is still lagging a bit. So for Matt and I, we kind of did things backwards. I don't know if you guys caught on. I said I have an 11-year-old, and we've only been married for 10 years. So, I'm sure some of you guys did the math there. So for us, we, like I said before, met when I was not a Christian. And so we did not do things the way that God would call us to do them. And so we had our son pretty early in our relationship. So it was a brand new relationship, coming from two completely different families and lifestyles. And I mean, we could not be more polar opposite, and we still are so polar opposite, even though we've been together for 11 years now. But just being brand new to that, and then throwing a baby in the mix was very interesting. So I'll say beforehand, when we met, we, like you were saying, Leah, it was kind of like you really only had to think about you. I know that sounds so weird, but like you have to think about the other person with you too, but it's not a lot, like you don't have to divide amongst a lot. We were having sex all the time, because what else do you do when you're young and single and live together, and work. And so, we had our son, and all of that dramatically changed. Just to hit a few of them that you said, after you have a baby, life changes, and not only just life in the realm of like not sleeping and adjusting your time, but just like you as a woman changes. Like your hormones are fluctuating, your body looks different than it used to look. Like there's all these insecurities that surface. And so I think for us, it was just really coming to the terms of communicating what does this new season look like and reshifting our expectations like we were talking about earlier. And expectations constantly shift in marriage. And so it was just having that open conversation of like, listen, I know you slept 9 hours last night, but homegirl slept too. So what you think is going to happen is not going to happen. And so just being really honest and vulnerable and accepting the outcome of that. Sometimes there was moments when we would literally knock down, drag out, fight over it just because, you know, he wanted intimacy. I wasn't in a place of giving intimacy. And we just had to have that knock down, drag out fight. Like it wasn't cute understanding. Oh, I understand, honey. I get it. Like it wasn't always like that. And it was working through those moments and just ironing them out as time went on. By the time our second son came around, expectations were pretty clear. So we didn't have as much of the headbutting and the fighting with that second round. And I would just say, like, give grace to yourself as a new mom. You are going through so many changes and you're not going to be the same. And that's kind of the point. As we get older, we don't stay the same. Like Danielle at 19 and Danielle at 30 should not be the same person. And that is okay. And just have grace with understanding. But I would say heavily communicate where you are. Like at the time, I didn't even understand, but with our oldest, looking back, I had postpartum depression and I didn't know that that's what I had. But also Matt didn't know that's what I had because I didn't communicate. Like, this is what I'm going through. This is what's happening with me. These are the thoughts I'm having. Yeah. And I would just say, like, be gracious to yourself. Tons of communication is 100% key. And just love those babies because it's hard. But I used to hate this. Everyone would always say, enjoy the season you're in. It's fleeting. I would be like, no, you don't understand. But now being out of that season, I would have to say that that was probably the best advice you can give any new mom is enjoy it. Enjoy the sleepless nights. Enjoy the constant needing you. Enjoy it because it's seriously like my son turned 11 and I was like, wait, how did that happen? Like last week I was just rocking you to sleep. And so just enjoy the season and have grace with yourself, have grace with your husband, and just do the best you can.
You touched on something there about bodies. I didn't even think about that. Your body goes through so much change with that, especially with the first baby, and you're like, and your husband will come to you and you're like, I'm literally feeding a human. I'm growing a human and then I'm feeding a human. I can't even think of myself as a woman anymore. I feel like a milk production factory, and you change, and you don't expect that that's what your reality is going to look like. When you think about babies coming, you think of baby showers and all the cute things and the pictures and the family, but you don't think about the sleepless nights. And honestly, I think if we all knew about them ahead of time, we might not be so eager to be moms if we knew it would be that challenging. But yeah, it is difficult. Thank you so much, Danielle. Brandy, how would you weigh in on that? You're on mute. Let me unmute you. Yeah, you're still. There you go. I can hear you.
Okay. Sorry about that. First of all, Danielle, somebody said in our little chat over here, thanks for the transparency. I couldn't agree more. And I think there's power for women to say, yeah, I didn't feel great about the way I looked in the mirror. I remember being pregnant with my first son, and like I felt really good about myself for a while. Like I would look in the mirror and I'd look down just at the top of my belly and I'd have no stretch marks. And I thought, man, I am banging out this pregnancy thing like a pro. Like, you got nothing on me. All these women that are complaining. And then I caught a glimpse of myself in a full length mirror, and I looked from my belly button down like I had been mauled by a tiger. And I remember like this switch flipped, and all of a sudden I was appalled at my body. I was completely traumatized by what I had seen because I wasn't expecting that. And so every time my husband at the time would look at me afterwards, and I'd be like, especially being naked, there was nothing more vulnerable to me than being naked in my post-baby body. And now I've had 4 babies, and nothing is where it used to be. Like nothing. There is no garment on the planet that makes that happen anymore. and just getting to a point where I have to say, okay, yeah, I don't look like that. And especially with my husband now, because Lee, you've mentioned now, Jason's my third husband. And I had 2 children in my first marriage, 2 children in my second marriage. Jason and I have experienced a couple of miscarriages, but we've not had children together from that standpoint. But he tells me all the time, babe, you're gorgeous, you're sexy, you're beautiful, I love you. But for me, that mentality, I still see that 20-year-old girl with all the stretch marks and the things not going. And now I'm 44 and things definitely don't look like they used to. And, that's just one area, I think, how children kind of shift the dynamic, the fatigue, the exhaustion. And, we talk a lot about the baby season, but I'll tell you that the teenage season, if you're not there yet either, can be exhausting. It can, these little humans that you're trying to make, productive, reasonable, grace-filled contributors to society, all of a sudden, I understand why some species eat their young. It's a joke and we see it as a meme, but there are times when I'm like, I get it. Like, I don't like you right now. If I had not birthed you with my own body, I would probably donate you to someone else to do for a while. And that changes the dynamic, right? It changes the dynamic. And for Jason, bless his heart, he walked in, not only did he walk into a woman with 4 kids, one of them still in diapers, but he walked into 2 of those kids being very antagonistic because they had watched me fail at a marriage already. They knew I had divorced their father and it was not a comfortable co-parenting situation. They watched me dive right back into a second relationship before I was ready and have 2 more kids that they believed replaced them. They'd watched that marriage fail. And then Jason walked into all of this just mess. Like, he really did. He walked into a really tough dynamic, 2 baby daddies who I was still co-parenting with and trying to find a way to get my footing right again with the Lord and what that meant for me. And he was an atheist and I was not. So that all trying to raise children in the church with a husband who was not that, it was a lot. And we had to stop and shift. I think the biggest dynamic for me was I had to remember that just because he was a good man and I had parented for 11, 12, 13, 14 years, that I had already gone through some phases with my kids, he never had. He had not. And I had to adjust my expectations that he would know what to do with these humans. And I also had to remind my kids that, listen, at the end, someday down the road, you're all going to grow up and marry someone and move out. And he and I, we're forever. So, I have to defend this relationship. And sometimes I even have to defend this relationship from me. I love you. I would die for my friend. But
Yeah.
I had to remind my kids and myself a lot that I had to choose my husband over and over and over again. That can be a tough space to be, from that perspective, from a blended family perspective.
I feel like we could do a whole discussion just on co-parenting and blended families, and that's something I'd probably like to dive in on down the road. And I'll be inviting you back for that, Brandy.
Okay.
I had the same realizations when Grady became a stepdad, and I think I'm so proud of him. He handled it so beautifully because he had been a child of divorce, so he'd been a child of a blended family, and he had a lot of sensitivities about what to do and what not to do about that. But it's still a hard road to navigate. My hat's off to anyone who's a step parent, because it is a really weird no man's land place to be.
Yes.
To try and be present and loving and all of the things that a parent in your household needs to be, while not claiming someone else's ground, and honoring and being sensitive to the hearts of the children that are in their care. Christina, go.
Yeah. Hey, Leah, that'd be great if you did something on, children and blended. I just want to touch on this really quick because it was something we never saw coming when we came together as husband and wife, and we each brought a child. We had, even before Jesus, we had this idea of oneness and togetherness, but it was at a time where our kids were in school. And so the step parent and blended family language started to come in our life, and we were not prepared for that. We didn't know what that was. And I just love how God is, even when you're not living for him or believing in what he can do in your life, he is pursuing you and teaching you things that you could never do on your own. Yeah. So something we learned very early when our kids' friends were going through divorce in second and third grade, and it was very hard. It was very it was very sad to our kids to watch their friends go through divorce, very messy and suffer. So what we learned from those hardships from the families around us was to never use language that divided the family that was now coming together, like step and yours and mine. And I don't say that with judgment. I know some people do for whatever reason, but for us and our family, we believe that a lot of our healthiness at that time without God was because we didn't speak that division into our family. Your kids, my kids, we were one family, and we were a mess, but we were one. And I think that was just an important piece that we had that held these kids together before Jesus came in, to give them understanding what was happening to their family.
Yeah, I not to interrupt, and Danielle, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there, babe. I agree with you. I could not, though. I think one of the things that we had to kind of get your point at, because there was Jesus and there was not Jesus. Every household had a different way of approaching it for us. And I came from a broken family. My ex-husband came from a broken family. My first husband's father died, but his parents were married forever. And Jason, his parents are still married to this day. They were high school sweethearts since 14, 15 years old. And we sat down before we knew anything. It was, I don't want this for my kids. I knew that brokenness was not an option. I knew it had to stop with me. And I remember a conversation that we sat down and had with my second husband when Jason and I decided to get married and started to get really serious. And he came into my kids' lives, where we sat down with my ex-husband, and they had a conversation, and he literally said, I'm here to love them. I'm here to support the two of you. I don't want to be, their dad. I'm not here to take your place, but this isn't about us. And it really resonated that for us, their wholeness had nothing, it wasn't about our selfishness or our hurts. Our marriage didn't need to bleed into how our kids were walking in their lives and what kind of adults they became. But we had to choose to make it that way as the adults. We had to make that choice very intentionally, over and over again.
Yeah.
Family is a tough word to navigate in a blended situation. If the other parent is absent and out of the picture, I think it's a whole lot easier to pull that new family together and call it a family. When your kids have another family elsewhere, that definition has to broaden, and their view of family changes. And it's one thing I've noticed with my kids is that when too many people come in and out of that, family becomes a very vague term, because there's a rotational door in there that makes it hard for them to grasp that. And so we've had to be very intentional about defining our family as bigger than just the people who live in this house, but it includes my ex-husband, and it includes his son. And so that definition has now had to get bigger, because I think when we limit it, it can be challenging. But everybody's situation is different. I know people whose exes are not in the picture. Those daddies or those moms, they're gone. And so that new family that's coming together is it. That's all that child has. But it's different for everybody. Danielle, were you going to say something there?
I was, but it wasn't like, I was just going to also something that came into my mind as a new mom.
Yes.
It's hard, like being a new mom, but I didn't want to interrupt. Like, y'all's conversation was great. I do think it is needed, Leah. I definitely think a blended family conversation would be really important to have. Yeah. But also just remembering as a new mom that although your life does evolve around your baby, you cannot forget your husband. Because I feel like with a new child, our first son, I was like, he needs me you're sufficient. You are a sufficient adult. Like, this new baby needs me for everything. He can't even eat without me. And that is true. There's so much truth to that statement, but also not forgetting, like, although your husband is a sufficient adult, he was first. And it's so important to kind of, like you were saying, Brandy, protect that, even not in a blended family situation, but even with biological children, to not lose sight of, like, how important it is to navigate your marriage and not buy into the excuses of He doesn't need me. He's sufficient. He's this, he's that. This little baby needs everything from me. And really just navigating that. And also lean on your tribe. Like, oh my gosh, without my mama friends, I would have died. So I just think it's important to like be transparent with them and let them know what you're going through and let them come in and help. I mean, I cannot think of the times that they would just shut up my door with dinner and like, hey, we heard this week was a bad week for you. Here's some dinner. Or even just like kicking, like my in-laws one time showed up and kicked me and Matt out of our house with our baby. He was 4 months old. We only lasted 45 minutes, but it was such a much needed 45 minutes. And so just allowing people to interrupt that and from the outside perspective coming in and helping keep your marriage on track and love on your kids with you. I think those are like important things.
So good.
So good. I was going to say something, Leah, just because like a lot of you are speaking about like the blended family aspect of things. And I'm one that doesn't have the blended family aspect, but I just wanted to say that I feel like now different, yes, obviously, but it's just as hard to blend two people, periods,
Yes.
expectations and agendas and ideas of how things should be handled with kids, period, in general. And I feel like that it evolves and it changes through the different stages and ages that your kids are going through. Like I think when my children were younger, in their younger ages, my husband really like allowed me to make the majority of the decisions. But as they're evolving into teenagers and their own people and their own minds, and they're doing things outside of our home more than ever and making their own decisions, the teenage years have proven to be extremely challenging for us, particularly because my husband is so passionate about wanting my children to have everything that he never had, as am I. But even that looks different for my husband as it does for me. And I was just going to say for me and my husband personally, we use so many resources to help us see each other's perspective and to bring us back together again when things get really rough. We have been to every marriage group, marriage counseling, marriage conference. I am like with Pastor Bob every single time that I need him. And I wanted to quote something that he taught me. And that is, I apply all the time in arguments. You can either be right or you can be happy. And so and that goes along with like the old saying of like picking your battles and stuff like that. Because to y'all's credit earlier, which somebody was saying, I think it was you, Brandy, how you had to make the choice to put your husband first, which I think is super important. And a lot of times as mothers, it's very natural for us to choose our kids or to put our kids first. That takes no effort. We are mamas. But with our husbands, yeah, it does take a little bit more effort to put them first. But having said that, there have been moments where I have definitely felt like this is a moment where my kids need to see me choosing them as well. So, and not even to say that I'm choosing them over my husband, but choosing a perspective as the right thing in that moment, which of course you have to handle that respectfully. And it's not an easy thing to navigate. And I have definitely not gotten it right every time, hence why I need Pastor Bob so bad. But I think also too, putting ourselves in the position to be educated by other married couples and the groups and the, all those networks that are available. We have so much knowledge and experience at our fingertips. I say use it. Plug yourself in those different resources, read the books, watch the messages on marriage, just you have to fight for this, you know, and it's not always the same cookie cutter answer every single time. Sometimes you're going to figure it out with just the two of you, and sometimes you're not. And like you said, Danielle, sometimes you need to call your tribe, crying your eyeballs and saying, I am overwhelmed with emotion right now. The water is muddy. I cannot think clearly. I need somebody to rein me back in here, please.
Yes.
And so I
So
love that.
Danielle, you just took us beautifully to our last set of questions for this episode, and that's on conflict. And I think the reason those go naturally hand in hand is that conflict really starts entering in even more strongly into the relationship when we do have kids, because the financial pressures get tougher. Our kids need things. Those paychecks get thinner and thinner in terms of everything they've got to cover. When kids come into the world and we think babies are expensive, they get really expensive when they start getting into expensive activities, and they need new cleats, or they need to go to a dance competition, or all of the things that our kids are doing, and that stretches and tests marriage like no other. So there's financial stress, there's the stress of, again, of being tired, there's the stress of now you have a responsibility together to raise human beings. And like you said, we don't always see eye to eye about that because we don't come from the same perspective. We didn't have the same modeling of what that looks like. So then you have those conflicts. So you have some sets of conflicts before kids come, and then they come and it's like, okay, now it really got tough. Like it really began now. And we have to navigate this family life together because now we're leading people. It's one thing when we're just walking side by side, but now we have little human beings that we're leading, and that's a huge responsibility, and there's a lot of pressure. And so I want to talk about conflict a little bit, and how we all manage it, because not everybody. One of the things I think couples have to learn to do is fight well. There are some people who would say that the definition of a good marriage is couples who don't ever fight, and I will tell you that I don't subscribe to that ideology, because I would wonder what the heck is going on there. If you're never fighting, you're probably not talking, and you actually may not be facing each other, spiritually, emotionally, physically, metaphorically, whatever. You may be distracted, and one of the reasons you're not fighting is you're not facing. So I want to talk a little bit about that. What's one thing about your spouse that really drives you crazy? And we're not going to throw our husbands under the bus here. We started with love. We're going to stay in the mindset of love, but we all have a little something that drives us crazy, or is a frequent source of conflict. And I'll be the first one to go out of the gate with that one. And what have you learned about fighting well? What does it mean to fight well? Because there is an act to it. There's a way to resolve conflict and to model it for our children. Because I believe if our children don't see us resolving conflict, they're also not going to know how to do it. And how do you get back to the loving place, what I call the loving place, when you have had those moments of conflict? So I can tell you with my husband, probably the thing that drives me crazy on the daily is that he is somewhat OCD, which makes him an incredible firefighter and paramedic, very detailed. I've been blessed to do a couple of ride-alongs with him in his career and watched him in action and literally bawl my eyes out because he's so good at what he does. I could not, in an emergent moment, think about what drug I have to give, what dosage it has to be, how many I've given already, how many compressions have I done for CPR. It's just a ton of pressure, and he handles it so well because he's extremely detail oriented, makes him really good at what he does. But when he's home, he sometimes doesn't know how to turn that off. So I've learned that the best thing to do is to let him organize or OCD that out, because I've also learned that it gives him a lot of peace, that he cannot have peace if he does not have his mind on the details. And I'm not saying I'm not a detailed person, but I'm a little bit more laid back about stuff like that. Like, I really don't care if my pantry is organized or labeled or alphabetized. But if it makes my husband happy, then it makes him happy. And so I've had to learn that what a lot of times drives me crazy is him over operating in his gifting, like what he's really good at and what his temperament is, and to recognize it in that respect, and to learn that I probably do the same thing. So that's the one thing. But I will tell you that we have learned to fight toe to toe. We are always facing each other. We probably debate more than most couples because we're both extroverts, we're both talkative, we're both outgoing, we're both very opinionated, and so there's a whole lot of that, this going on in our house, never over anything big. And we have boundaries. We're not, and we can talk about those. What are your boundaries? We don't name call. We don't curse at each other. We don't slam doors. We don't throw things. We don't punch walls. We don't walk out on each other unless we need a cool off point. But for us, the rules are we fight it out until we work it out, and we get back to the loving place as quickly as we possibly can, because we both learned in other relationships that the longer you stay in a negative mindset about the person you love, the harder it is for you to get back to the way you want to stay in a loving frame of mind. So that's my 2 cents there, and I'm gonna go. Let's see who's going first on this one. Christina, what's the thing that drives you crazy, and then how have you guys learned to fight well and resolve conflict in your marriage?
Okay. First, I have to say that I went to Raul with this, and I said, "What do I have permission to share?" And so, and it was probably more a couple of things on my end, but we agreed listening on his end is a good source of conflict for us. I'm a talker; he's not. So when I do all my talking, I need him to listen. And in the serious matters of life, I don't mean just talk, but in the serious matters, I feel like he's not listening. But listening is so crucial in his job, and sitting in meeting after meeting after meeting and following up on those notes and what he's heard. So then, I fall into the comparison where you're listening there and not listening here. So that would cause us to not fight well years ago, as we continue to walk through this and learn how to honor and respect each other in fighting. Because of all my talking, I want to talk through every detail of conflict, where he's like, okay, that's a wrap. We can be done now. And I'm like, we didn't resolve anything. I still want to talk. And I think one of the ladies touched on this in a different topic. So what I've learned through his not listening is not everything is for his ears. That's where I follow my tribe. He's not going to get into a woman's place in listening to me. And it took me a long time to understand that. He's a man and he's a husband. He's not a woman. So God was very gracious in showing me that. But we still have to talk through things, and I still need him to listen. So the way that we fight well is the boundaries. We set boundaries of keeping respect. Voices have to stay calm, and we just have to finish it out. We have to wrap it up with, where are we going from here? Are we going to agree or agree to disagree? And that's going to be the end of it. And one other thing that I left out that is so important, because sometimes when we're talking through conflict, just by nature, we want to pull things into the topic that have nothing to do with the topic. And that's off the table for us. We have gotten better about not doing that, because then it allows us to focus on, the one subject without bringing everything else into it. And so a lot more peaceful these days with Jesus and learning.
That's good. Yeah.
Yeah.
Good stuff. Yeah. Kitchen sink, right? Throwing kitchen sinkers when you throw
Exactly.
it, or you're storing up and bringing back into every argument things from the past. We're big believers in, if we've already fought and resolved this, we're not bringing it up again. It's done. And that helps keep the slate clean. We're not
Exactly.
keeping score. There's not some sort of, check mark somewhere of who won the last argument, or who does this more or that more. I think it's important to keep that. Don't keep a record. We're not supposed to keep a record of wrongs, right? That's the very definition of love. So that's a big part of it. Melissa, what drives you? I already think I know how you're going to answer this, but what drives you crazy about Andy?
Like Christina, I kind of filtered everything through through Andy, because I felt it was very important to be transparent here, but I also wanted to be very honoring to him as well. And so one of the things that drives me batty about him is my husband loves stuff. He has an obsession with lunchboxes and all the containers that go in them, and flashlights and all the things, all kinds of things. And I learned very on in our relationship that it kind of goes back to the way that he was brought up. I was brought up in a home where I had everything I ever wanted, and he was brought up in a home where he didn't. He he had the needs but not the wants, and so he's been kind of making up for that. And so corralling his things is always kind of not always a source of conflict, but it's something I wrestle with, and allowing him to have his space. And sometimes that space flows out into other spaces, like COVID. His latest thing is sewing. He's sewing masks, and now he's preparing for Christmas. And so that can be a source of frustration and stress for me. We tend to argue very differently. I like to, I made an inner vow, unfortunately, before I got with him, but because I grew up in a broken home where my parents were always fighting, and in my first marriage, we were always fighting, that I was going to do things differently and that we weren't going to fight. That was, I don't know why I thought that. And so, so for the both of us, we stuffed things down for years. It just kind of piled on top of each other. And so when we argued, it used to be very explosive. It was very rare, very, very rare, but explosive. But now we tend to talk more about, but when I'm upset about something, I want to talk about the thing, and he wants to talk about all the things that he was not able to get out since the last argument. So we kind of have to shift a little bit. But I think the antidote for arguing is prayer. If things aren't going well, we both of us make this habit of stopping. Holy Spirit, help me in this situation. Or if has been wrong, if he's hurt my feelings, I would say, Holy Spirit, I need your help. And within just a few minutes, I watch him turn around. The Holy Spirit deals with him. It's important for us to do what we can do in the natural and let God be God, and let God handle our spouse. Yeah.
That's awesome.
And also, one other thing to add, I'm sorry, and sometimes it takes one person swallowing their pride and saying, I'm sorry, even if you're still upset, because it will open up, those communication channels, allows you to talk in a healthy way. So that's always works for us.
I've learned that I'm sorry just needs to be I'm sorry. It can't be I'm sorry, but.
Right. You can never have a but.
Sometimes we'll use I'm sorry as a means of opening the argument again. I'm sorry, but I just needed you to understand. I'm sorry. And then it negates the I'm sorry to begin with. And so I've learned over the years that when the Lord leads me to an apology, just to anybody, but it just needs to be an apology. It doesn't need to be excuses or an opportunity to reopen and start round 2 or 5 or whatever of that same debate. I had to laugh when you said that, Melissa, about Andy's things, because I often joke that the only person I'd ever have to worry about Grady cheating on me with would be the Amazon man. Because he likes toys too, so that's doesn't bother me as much, because we're it's fun, but I know it can be a challenge too. But I think keeping a sense of humor, and again keeping our minds in the loving place, when when my heart is stayed on how much I love him and how good he is, and all of the things that I admire about him. And I think about the scripture that just is, set your mind on these things, that those things that are lovely and are of good report and worthy of focusing on. There's a laundry list of things that I could say about, we all could, about our husbands. That list would be 10 times longer than the few things that might annoy me. And so the more I can keep my eye on those things, the easier it is to move away from the others. Melissa.
You have one thing. There's a Bible verse that I love. It's Ephesians 5:33, and it says, each of you must love his wife as he loves himself, and his wife must respect her husband. And I think God knew that intuitively we would love our husbands, but we wouldn't always necessarily intuitively respect them. So respect has to be very key. And in my instance, respect means not messing with his things.
Men put respect above love. That's right. Such a core value to them. And women tend to reverse that sometimes, although they both are very important to me. But I do think that a man would tell you that respect first, and that respect is a demonstration of love for them in many ways. So we're going to wrap up in just a second. And anybody have a last comment on conflict? Brandy, and then Danya.
Yeah, I think Danielle and I need to hang out because we seem to have like thoughts about all this stuff. Melissa made a comment about getting to a point where you pray and you ask the Holy Spirit, and it reminded me, Jason and I, one of our big conflicts in the beginning of our relationship was that I was a believer and he was not. And as our marriage kind of came to a head with that and started to fall apart, I remember praying and asking, because obviously we know that the Lord wants his children to turn to him. Like, I knew that God had a plan for Jason. I knew that he loved Jason, and I couldn't figure out why he couldn't see that. So I took it upon myself, this traditional Christian role of being his preacher and not his wife, not his partner, and trying to listen to him and respect where he had come from and why he believed the way he did and why he did not believe the way I did. And I remember the Holy Spirit very clearly saying to me, Brandy, I need you to stop talking so he can hear me speak. Because I was doing all of the preaching, all of the talking, all of the convincing, and I have come to over time that was how we fought. I felt the need to constantly have the last word, especially if I knew it was right. And I love that Danielle said, would you rather be right or would you rather be happy? And my need to be right actually took us to almost the end of our marriage, not his need to not be wanted by Jesus. And it had nothing to do with his unbelief. It was the fact that I so badly wanted to be right in that situation. And I wanted him to admit that he was wrong, that brought us to the divorce table. And so I just, Melissa, that we do, you have to stop and pray and say, Lord, this isn't, whether I respect him, love him, agree with him or not, he is your child. And I have to trust that you are speaking to him, and that if he tells me he's listening to you, that I trust that you are God and you're going to do exactly what you have said you will do in his heart, just like you will in mine. So.
Absolutely. Danielle.
Okay, just really quickly. I think because we fought unfair for a really long time, which again, I'll share that part later, part 2. But I think the important thing for us was coming into the space that we are now was learning to fight from the place of I and not you. And so I just wanted to say that is so critical in the midst of an argument, to not you did, you blah, you, because immediately what you're doing is already setting you and your spouse up on separate sides, and you're not supposed to be on separate sides. And so coming from the place of I felt this is how that affected me. It's the I and the me's, not the you's and the yours and the, that the focus of them. So that was super important for us. Like, and now that's like a rule of ours. If either one of us are entering into you, we go, nope, we're entering into you. We can't talk right now. We take 5 minutes. Sometimes we can't come back and get into the loving place as quick as we like Leah said earlier. So something Pastor Bob taught us was schedule it. Like, if this is so much bigger that you can't come back together in 5 minutes, he said your limit is 24 hours. So you say, okay, at 5 o'clock tomorrow, we're coming back together and we're going to talk about this.
That's good.
So the I is so important. I, me, not you. And then scheduling, when are you going to come back into that loving place? If it can't be resolved immediately, if it is something bigger where maybe you need a mediation or you need a timeout to bring a third person in or whatever, but making sure you're scheduling when is that going to be resolved. Those have been 2 life-changing boundaries for us in fighting.
Such practical tips there, Danielle. I think that's a great place for us to end, because one of the things I want to make sure we're doing in both of these segments is giving people practical tools, about how to resolve conflict. And I love that idea. I mean, the Bible says not to go to bed on our anger, but sometimes that's a little too soon. If you've been fighting at 9 p.m., you're probably going to go to sleep on your anger. But having that 24-hour window, or having a specific set of time where you're like, I'm not going to let this go on. We're going to be intentional about revisiting it, always to the point of resolving it. There's the point of conflict for us isn't to just stay camped out in the conflict, but it's to reach a place of resolution. I will say, on your point, Brandy, I can so relate to what you said about trying to be our husband's preacher or savior or minister or theologian, or even holding our husbands to the same expectation of what their divine appointment is, what their gifting is, what kind of ministry God's called them to, the way they're going to operate in the body of Christ doesn't have to be the same as mine. And I think for me, early on in Grady and I's relationship, I pretty much stepped back and said, your relationship with God is yours. We're one flesh, and we're not going to go separate ways on that ever. But I can't be your savior. That's not my job to be your teacher or minister. That journey is your journey, your intimate journey with God alone. And we talked about in the first episode of this series that each one of us has to find our way to the table of God. We can't drag somebody there with us. We all have an assigned seat at the table of the Lord. I have one with my name on it. My husband has one with his name on it. He's going to stand before God to answer for or have God really take a look at his life, to whatever that means. I'm not going to be standing there, and I'm not going to be a proxy for him, and he's not going to be a proxy for me, and we can't appropriate each other's faith that way. Faith can't be by proxy. And so I always tell him, you're released from any expectations on my part that you have to be anything at all in that regard. That's between you and God. And you're also not going to pursue that the same way that I will. And that relationship is going to be unique. He has a completely different call in his life than I do. We all have the same call to follow God, but those appointments and assignments are going to look very different. Yeah. So that's going to take us to the end of this session, which went a whole lot longer than I thought it would, but the discussion is so great. I feel like we could talk for hours about it. So let's pause here. I want to thank everybody who's watched all the way to the end of this. Look for this to be posted, and then look for part 2, which will probably be posted within a few days after this one, so that you can stay connected to the conversation. And we'll dive back into this topic. So on part 2, we're going to jump right off the deep end and talk about sex and intimacy, because we absolutely cannot talk about marriage without talking about something so amazing, so challenging, so often misunderstood, and so often a very central problem in marriages that don't go the distance. So we hope you'll join us next time, and thank you for joining us today.